Welcome to another JJ in the Field, time agronomic tips when you need them most. I'm your host, Jonah Johnson, and today we're here in a beautiful sunny day at the end of September 2021. We're finally into harvest for the most part across Ohio. Some guys waiting for corn to dry out in the field, some beans still senescent in places, but for the most part a lot of us have hit the gas and are starting to finally bring in our bounty of crops this year. Some of the exciting news that we've heard some really good yields this year, and if you think about the growing season we've had, we go back to the end of April. We had that tremendous cold spell and snap after about 2.5 weeks of beautiful weather that who knew we would experience that late in the season. And then to compound that, we had some better weather into May. And you remember the big freeze event that happened the last weekend of May, and that really set back some crops, some of the early planted crops. This year we're kind of over the gamut across Ohio. We have some early stuff that looks pretty good, and we had some later stuff that was planted that looks really good. And from the reports that we're hearing and seeing in some of our plots coming off, yields are exceptionally well this year. Can't say that for everywhere in Ohio, but a majority of what we've been hearing has been really exciting this year, and I hope you guys see the same on your farms this year. So what I want to talk about today is and we'll talk about corn this week, is that this year, thinking about the growing season, we had some of the planting challenges, and then we had basically about 6 weeks of really dry, hot weather for the most part across Ohio. And when we experienced that, the corn went through a lot of ups and downs. A lot of warm nighttime temperatures, where we get a lot of respiration and the high rates of respiration within the corn plants. So they were cannibalizing that energy they encapsulated during the day to just stay alive, and not as much being pushed into the kernels. But nevertheless, the corn plants did what they were supposed to do, and we've had, again, back to my comments about some really successful yields. So what I'm concerned about coming in this fall, when we're hearing reports of that, is that the field behind me, and you'll see here in the aerial imagery that'll follow, you're seeing spots in the field that's not so easy to see from the road, that probably either premature died in spots, when that's not uncommon to see, where it follows some different soil types, maybe ridges, low gravelly bottom grounds, what have you, and everybody has those spots within their fields. And so as you're looking across these images, you'll note that those areas died earlier, similar to some of the corn right behind me. And if you pan off to the side, and also in some of the aerial images you'll see as it spans out, you'll see some upper canopy stay green still in the plants, and that's a great thing. When we have some stay green canopy, it's still encapsulating energy from the sun. If we're not all at black layer yet, it's still going to push some carbohydrates energy into those ears. And so as these high demanding plants have been pumping as much energy into these ears as possible, and we go back to the stressful high nighttime temperatures and the droughty conditions we experience and the heat across Ohio, these plants are going to become very fragile as we get into fall. And so one thing I want to make you guys cognizant of is this is not a good year to let our corn stand to November. We call the Thanksgiving corn situation, where we're hoping to get as much out naturally and we don't have to dry as much. This is not a good year to try to push that. Behind me here, if we start doing the push test and seeing what stalk integrity is, you'll note that a lot of these plants, just doing the 20-degree push test, they're already broke and easy, and they're falling over. And so same thing for shank quality, to try to prevent eardrop. We want to go after these corn plants soon and get those out of the field and try to dry those down artificially if possible. And so things that come into play, not only from the cannibalization of the stalks naturally from the corn plant, sending all that energy up into the ear, but also that vectors in stalk rots and ear molds. And so we're already starting to see some stalk rots come into play. We've seen some fusarium stalk rot already showing up in a lot of guys' fields, some diplodia ear molds, some trichoderma ear molds, which is a dark green fluffy mold. Now that's not associated with a mycotoxin or vomitoxin per se, but we are seeing some gibberella ear mold. So the gib ear mold is the mold we're most concerned about in regards to mycotoxins that create the vomitoxin, and then DON, the acronym for deoxynivalenol. And so that is what ruminants obviously push away and do not want to eat, and if they do eat, it can make them sick. And then of course, if it makes it into the human food chain, there's a very low tolerance for that to even be used in any type of food prep for the human consumption. So things to be looking for in your fields, be looking for ear molds. If you do get some of these ear molds like gibberella ear mold, you want to either harvest those last or get them out of the field, dry them down below 15% moisture, store those in a separate bin. The other ear mold, same thing, we can dry them down and stop them from festering in your grain bins. Hopefully that'll keep them at bay. And then mix and dilute those if you do have some of that in your grain to keep those concentration down low. So keep in mind, make sure you're doing the push test, the stalk integrity test down low, pushing on those stalks, pushing at 20 degrees. Are they falling over? Are they ready to break? Those are the ones we want to make sure that we're going after and not allowing those to fall over, because God forbid we have a bunch of corn on the ground. Obviously it's hard to encapsulate and get into your machine. So some other things to keep in the back of your mind is on the fall armyworm kind of epidemic we had this year. You think about, we had 2 primary major moth flights that laid eggs in 2 generations, and there's a very possibility that we could have a 3rd generation showing up this year. Here late in the fall. Now, one thing we have in our corner is that these moths, these caterpillars, the worms, if you will, are very sensitive to cold temperatures. So you think about when we had that cold snap about a week and a half ago, we had about 60 hours pretty uniformly across Ohio that we got down into the upper 40s to 50s, and that's very mortal to these larvae. So not to say they couldn't survive that, but one thing it'll also do is deter those moths, those females, from laying additional eggs and making a 3rd generation possible. So we're hoping we won't see a problem. But some things to keep an eye on and don't forget about is to be looking at if you have some newly planted wheat that's emerged, if you have some newly planted cover crops, and then also if you had, say you did some interseeding or a new seeded lawn, because this year they were actually very destructive in people's lawns. And so those are some major areas I'd encourage you to walk and look and keep an eyeball on, because those are all very sensitive young plant tissue that could be demolished very quickly by these voracious caterpillars if they get to that point. But fingers crossed we won't get to that point. So one more thing that we could add while we're looking late season is that some of the plant diseases in corn actually became very, very bad even after fungicides were actually used at the tasseling time as normal. And so one thing to do, you can do some late season scouting, look at your upper canopy. You know, did we have late northern come in? Did we have some gray leaf spot or common diseases? But tar spot of corn was quite rampant in northern Ohio, and then southern rust made its presence into southern Ohio with a pretty big footprint. And so when we think about those 2 major diseases that are going to become very impactful here in Ohio, we've even had fields that got sprayed twice and it still came back, and we saw some in these upper canopies in places of Ohio. And so late season, to try to figure out what those diseases may be, you want to look, because as they senesce and get older, if you will, in the field on these leaves as the plant dries down, all these pustules, depending on what disease it is, they start to turn very dark. And so when you look at this image, you'll see that tar spot stays the same on the plant. So when you're looking at the little dots on there, you'll be able to tell that pretty easily. But trying to determine whether it was southern rust, common rust, or other disease pustules, you just want to be vigilant to that too, because you know this is a great time to make plans for our next corn crop coming in 2022, whether or not we have to change our fungicide programs, maybe the chemistries you use this year. But we just want to be vigilant of that, to kind of do a post-mortem right now to gauge what the presence is for going forward. So in summary today, think about, again, stalk quality, ear molds, ear rots. Look for that in your fields. Be vigilant of that. Also, keep in mind our late season diseases. Look at those corn, maybe do a last scouting trip through some of your fields as you're looking at ears and seeing what's ready for harvest. And compared to the notes, all the field guides and the universities have great pictures out there that could couple with this video to help you identify what diseases did you actually have in your fields, and was it worse than you found earlier in the season, maybe when the fungicide time occurred. And then lastly, fall armyworm. If we do have that 3rd brood, that 3rd generation of worms that could be feeding, keep your eyeballs out on your newly seeded lawns, your newly seeded wheat, and your cover crops. So for more information, feel free to follow up with your local ASA or anybody on the PCT team. I'm Jonah Johnson. Thanks for watching.